A lot of people have not lost their faith. Instead, faith has lost its fit in their lives. And if that's where you are right now, I want to suggest something to you right up front. You may not be failing spiritually. Quite the contrary, you may be outgrowing a particular spiritual container. Because you see, right now, all over the place, there are a whole bunch of people out there who still care about truth. They still care about love. They still care about meaning. They still care about God in some way. And many of them may even still care about Jesus. But they cannot make themselves fit inside of the version of Christianity that they inherited. They cannot unsee what they have seen about the world. They cannot unknow what they have learned. They cannot force their conscience back into submission. And they cannot pretend that the old answers still work just because they used to make them feel safe. If this is you right now, you know how disorienting all of this is. Because you don't feel like you can neatly fit into being an atheist, but at the same time, you may not feel like you can neatly fit into being a Christian any longer either. And it's not because you're trying to be rebellious, and it's not because you're trying to be trendy. And it's also not because you're trying to be creatively disruptive. You're just trying to be honest about who you are and where you are spiritually. And here's the problem with that honesty. It creates a crisis. Because most of us were taught that if faith stops fitting into your life, then it's somehow our fault. Maybe we're drifting. Maybe we're compromised. Maybe we're lukewarm. Maybe we just want to go out and have fun sinning. Or maybe we've been deceived. Or maybe we've just outright abandoned the truth. That's the script that many have received. But what if that script is completely and utterly wrong? What if faith no longer fits, not because your soul is collapsing, but because your soul is waking up? Think about it this way. A child eventually outgrows their clothes. And that doesn't mean that the child is broken. It just means that growth has happened. The problem is not the body. The problem is that the old shape no longer matches the new reality. And I think this is where a lot of the church alumni are. I think this is where they're living at this moment, not in some sense of spiritual emptiness, but in some sense of spiritual mismatch. If you're part of the church alumni, you may still hunger for transcendence. You may still pray, even if you're not quite sure who it is that you're praying to. You may find yourself still moved and enthralled by the teachings of Jesus. And you may still believe that love is at the center of all things. You may still want compassion, mercy, justice, and depth. And when the form of religion that you've inherited is built more around boundary maintenance than any sense of real transformation, eventually a lot of sincere people are going to just hit a wall. And hitting that wall might come through learning about faith. Maybe you study history and you study the Bible and you study other religions, and next thing you know, you realize, wow, things are a whole lot more complicated than I was told. Or maybe hitting that wall comes through moral awakening. You start to look at the way that the church treats LGBTQ people or women, and you don't like it. You start to notice the colonialism, the religious exclusivism, the religious supremacy, the fear-based belonging. And you don't like it. And suddenly you realize you just can't call this holiness just because it's wrapped up in some form of theology. Or hitting that wall might come through personal experience as you encounter beauty and wisdom and healing and depth outside of the approved boundaries of your tradition. And as a result of hitting the wall, however it happens to be that you hit it, you now have a problem because you were told that truth lived in one house, but now you've discovered personally that it's dwelling somewhere else too. And once that happens, something shifts. You begin to realize that maybe the issue is not that you stopped caring about the sacred. Maybe the real issue is that you can no longer believe that the sacred belongs to one institution. And by the way, if this is the kind of topic that you enjoy, I want you to know that you are in the right place, because I make videos for progressive Christians, questioners, and the church alumni. You know, those people who live on the edge of faith, whether they've left the church behind or are still sitting in the pews. But if this is you, please like and subscribe so we can stay connected. This is where I want to introduce a phrase that can help some people, and it is this: religious fluidity. Now, I know that phrase can sound abstract, but it's really pretty simple. Basically, religious fluidity is what happens when a person no longer treats their religion as a sealed system behind hard walls, and instead they begin moving more freely across religious boundaries. Think about it this way. A religiously rigid person believes truth, wisdom, and spiritual authority all have to stay inside their institution. A religiously fluid person no longer believes that. They may still be shaped deeply by Christianity. They may still pray like a Christian, think like a Christian, and even feel emotionally connected to Jesus. But they no longer believe that they must reject every insight, every practice, or every experience that comes from outside of Christianity in order to be faithful. So maybe a religious person might be someone who is a Christian who practices mindfulness and learns from Buddhism. Or maybe it's a person who still loves Jesus, but no longer believes that Christianity has a monopoly on God. Or maybe they still carry the Christian story, but they read broadly and pray openly and find wisdom in more than one place. That's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about religious fluidity. It does not necessarily mean that someone has left Christianity behind altogether. It just means that the boundaries of their religious identity have become far more porous. The spiritual life for them is no longer controlled by the old rule that says that truth can only come from inside of the tribe. A religiously fluid person may still carry Christian language, Christian memory, Christian symbolism, and even Christian devotion, but they no longer believe that Christianity has the right to own every single spiritual question, every source of wisdom, every path to truth, or even every experience of the divine. Here's why religious fluidity works so well for many of the church alumni. You see, for church alumni, when the form of faith you were given can no longer hold your conscience and your questions, your compassion and your lived experience, then something is going to have to give. And for many people, it's not their spirituality. Rather, it is the claim that one religious system gets to define reality for everyone on the planet at all times and in all places. Unfortunately, this movement toward religious fluidity is often seen by more conservative Christians as a decline of faith or a lack of commitment. But I, along with many Christians, do not agree. You see, instead, I see it as a form of discernment. Because it's really about a person realizing that belonging and truth are not always the same thing. It's about a person who is refusing to betray what they know in order to remain part of a tribe. It is about a person saying, I cannot force myself back into that smaller world just because that world once gave me the certainty that made me feel ultimately safe and secure. And yes, moving into religious fluidity is usually quite messy. You see, there's a lot of ambiguity, there's a lot of grief, there's a lot of loneliness sometimes. And there's a special loss of a clear script to guide your life. And for many, there's also this fear that maybe you're wandering off of the true path and potentially endangering your eternal soul. So yeah, that's pretty messy. But messy does not mean wrong. Sometimes messy is what honesty looks like when old certainties fall apart. Sometimes messy is what growth looks like before it has language to describe it. Sometimes messy is what happens when your soul refuses to keep lying in order to be included. And I think this is where many of the church alumni are today. They are not simply abandoning the faith. What they're doing is refusing a version of the faith that has become too cramped for their truth, too cramped for love, too cramped for reality, too cramped maybe even for their emerging understanding of God. So when faith no longer fits, I don't think the best question for them to ask is, what's wrong with me? I think the better question for them to ask is, what exactly is it that no longer fits for me? Because maybe what no longer fits is the fear. Maybe what no longer fits is the control. Maybe what no longer fits is that demand for certainty. Maybe what no longer fits is that tribal identity that pretends to be eternal truth. And maybe, just maybe, what feels like spiritual failure is actually the beginning of spiritual honesty. Because at the end of the day, I think all of this messiness is really about growing more in God and growing more into who you are truly meant to be. And all of this matters because once faith no longer fits that old container, a new question shows up. Who gets to own your spiritual life now? And that's where I want to go in the next video. Because for a lot of us, the deeper shift is not that faith has changed, it's that religion has stopped having the final say over who we are, what we are allowed to question, and where we are allowed to find truth. But before we go there, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. What was the first thing that made faith stop fitting for you? Was it a belief? Was it a moral issue? Was it an experience? Or was it something that just slowly happened over time? And if this enabled you to put words to something you've been experiencing for some time now, let me know down below in the comments. And if you've made it this far, please like and subscribe so we can stay connected. I'm Bo McGuffey of the Evolving Christian Faith Network. Until next time, peace.